No, I think we're ready to move forward. We waited some time, so I think we're ready to move forward.
Great. All right. So yeah, to start off, I think I wanted to just talk a little bit about the fact that the policy approach at Young Farmers kind of began from the perspective that if we focus on structural barriers, that we'll be helping all farmers, and we didn't specifically focus on race. And we have come to understand that that approach perpetuates marginalizing diverse voices from the process of designing shared solutions to shared policy challenges. And that if we're going to address the long histories of oppression in ag policy and other areas, we need to, those challenges must be met with intention. Um, and just a reminder, folks could mute for the time being. Thank you so much. Um, and so I wanted to talk through some examples of some of the gaps in how we've approached policy. And I'll use a couple of examples from some of the state policy campaigns that we've worked on. And just acknowledging those kind of missed opportunities or things that we maybe would have done a little bit differently, or would have at least asked some different questions kind of with if we had taken an approach that we're taking kind of going forward here. And one example is with beginning farmer tax credits. Really great idea for transferring land and assets to young and beginning farmers that our members in Minnesota kind of ran with, and had a successful campaign there to bring about that program in Minnesota. And then we worked on a similar program in Pennsylvania, and very simple design, designed to help transfer land and other agricultural assets, and by giving an income tax incentive. And what we didn't do in thinking through that policy is to ask, how could we advance racial equity in this policy? What could we have done to, while we're designing a new program, to include language that would have centered racial equity in its design? Maybe something that would have given prioritization to young and beginning farmers who identify as BIPOC, for instance, is something that we could have potentially woven into that policy proposal. And that's something that we're interested in, carrying forward our ideas like that. And similarly, with the New York land access bill that we worked on to open up the farmland protection law in New York, and improve that language so that state funding could be used toward the cost of putting easements in place that not only protect the land, but protect the affordability for the farmer, and ensure that a farmer will be the one who's owning that land going forward. We didn't ask what else we could have considered in opening up that part of the law, and trying to define a working farm easement. We could have engaged with more diverse voices, maybe looked at examples of cultural respect easements out there that include language for indigenous peoples in the area to have access to the land, or other things like that. I don't know what exactly would have changed there, but the point is that in the process of designing that policy proposal, we didn't ask what we could do to advance racial equity. So really going forward, our organization is focused on centering racial equity in the development and design of policy ideas and solutions, and trying to think about thinking about accountability and impact as much as intention when writing policy language. So I'm going to pass it off to Vanessa to talk a little bit about the federal policy platform.
Thank you, David. So, as many of you may be aware, as members of National Young Farmers Coalition, 2 years ago we undergo this process called a federal policy setting process. And basically this process set the stage on how do we wanted our members to choose what our policy priorities should be. Before that, we didn't really have like a really engaged process of setting federal policy priorities. We conducted a survey, we heard back from you, and based on what the survey told us, those are the things that we were putting forward as our priorities. And that was guiding like the state policy team and the federal policy team and many other international structure about how we were prioritizing resources and doing what kind of work. So 2 years ago, this process started, and what we heard, we selected a policy committee in that process. We did regional listening sessions. We did affinity groups listening sessions. And basically, what we kept hearing through that 2 year process, even before I got on board to the National Young Farmers Coalition, is that racial equity should be prioritized and it should be the baseline of everything we do. So last November, after a year of work with the policy committee and also, as David said, a long history of us trying to be more proactive and learning from allies and learning from ourselves and learning from the values that as an organization we should be holding ourselves accountable to and to our partners. You young farmers voted and decided that racial equity should be the baseline or federal policy work. And in the platform that we decided upon, racial equity was really expressed in the ways that we heard from our members, based on what we heard from our stakeholders and partners, and also the policy committee itself. So when we say that racial equity is the baseline of the work that we do, is like policy is not exception. Obviously, as an organization, we're doing a lot of racial equity work internally, but how does that translate to the work that we're doing in DC? How does that translate in the work that we're doing in your capitals all around the country? So the first thing that we have to always acknowledge is that policy by itself has many barriers. It has reinforced systematic racism and also has have prevented BIPOC farmers in a lot of uh, in committing in advocating for anti-racist policies. So keeping that in mind, that's why we heard back from you, and that's this is now written in our documents that we're gonna be sending to elect the members of Congress next week, and it's also now in our website. This is like our one of our top priorities that we are committing ourselves as an organization, and also in our policy work. So obviously, you guys here to learn about how we're going about that process, and hopefully, you can learn something from your own organizations about how we're going through this process, and also you can teach us in the process. As I say, well, this is the beauty of racial equity work. It never stops. It never is perfect. It's always evolving and changing. We are gonna be able to share some of that with you, with examples I'm gonna show you tonight. So one of the things that we are doing, and as the policy team, especially in the federal policy team that I belong, is first of all and foremost, we need to identify what we call racial equity metrics. These are SMART goals, and as you remember, SMART is usually needs to be obtainable, it needs to be measurable, it needs to be time sensitive. And usually what we try to do for these goals, they vary by organization, they vary by team. In our federal policy team, we have a specific set of goals that we had to meet monthly, and at the end of the year, we tally those, and those what we call usually a racial equity metrics that we're holding ourselves accountable to. The work that we're doing in policy is reflective of racial equity and prioritizing racial equity. And these are some of the suggested metrics that we are using internally. Obviously, we are a majority white organization, also in the farmers that we represent. So how do we can hold ourselves accountable to put forward and endorse policies that actually center the life experiences of BIPOC young farmers in our network, in our stakeholders, and also the coalitions that we belong. So the way we do that a lot is we accountability. What we do is we have what we call standing meetings. So like I had to have a monthly, once a week meeting with this organization that is a BIPOC led organization, or I have a bi-weekly meeting with a BIPOC farmer leader who is really good at telling me about how he is struggling with access to USDA programs. And also it's also holding ourselves accountable to the coalitions that we belong. We consult with many partners in many other coalitions that are BIPOC led, for us to focus more on what are the policies recommendations they're advocating for, that we can be allies and champion those recommendations us too. Again, in the way we do advocacy and policy work is, meeting with members of Congress, doing sign-on letters, asking you or members to call your members of Congress to engage on issues. But there are many different metrics that you can identify. These are some of the ones we identify as a team, and they're all not here, and they can change depending on the project that we're working on or in some other action that we're taking together with stakeholders and BIPOC allies. So again, depending on the work that you're doing, let that be a state or federal or in your own community, your racial equity metrics may look different. And at the end of the presentation, we're going to share with you this guide that has some suggested metrics that you can use for your own work. These are just some of the examples, the ones that we are holding ourselves accountable in that we are using in our own work for federal policy team. Another way that we are putting forward as a tool to prioritize racial equity is having a rubric. And I know when I say the word rubric, you're probably thinking it's like a scorecard or it's my grade depending on it. And the answer will be kind of, yes. So for this, what we did, we identify around 30 questions that we glean from other rubrics, from other racial equity literature, and from our own racial equity priorities in priorities as an organization. And also priorities that our farmers tell us should be a priorities if we were definitely pursuing racial equity in policy. So basically, this is just a spreadsheet. It has 30 lines. In every line, there is a question, and then you answer yes or no. Does this program or bill does this? Yes or no? And then you add comments or you explain the how. And what I like to say, I think the questions are actually the best way because you have to be justifying yourself as an organization, me as a policy advocate on your behalf. Is this policy that is being put forward that we should endorse or that we should advocate for? Is it meeting the things that our members are telling us we should be advocating for? And these are just some examples of the questions that we are using in that rubric. And these examples are really broad, like they're what we call like really racial equity broad. And some of the other examples are like, does this program or policy include young farmers of color on their design? Does this program or policy include young farmers of color access to land? Some of the questions vary in detail again, and we chose those questions to guide a racial equity rubric based on our priority areas, based on the feedback we heard from farmers and young farmers like you, and also for them also to guide us to hold us accountable. And I'm going to show you more about how we're doing that internally. Some of you may have heard about the Justice for Black Farmers Act. That is a great piece of legislation that was introduced in the last Congress last November. And it's probably going to be reintroduced again in the following weeks. So when we saw that piece of legislation, we did an analysis of it, a racial equity analysis using the rubric, and also consulting with our stakeholder partners about what this bill meant for them, because obviously we are not a Black farmer-led organization or mostly Black farmer organization. So first and before we do anything that is like outside of what we know are the young farmer priorities, we always consult with our partners before taking a step, because we are not the protagonists of this kind of legislation. We are the allies. And that being said, that also translates to any bills or policies and programs related to farm workers or related to Black farmers and BIPOC farmers. So we always holding ourselves accountable to our allies. And I think that's a core value of doing racial equity work. So for the Justice for Black Farmers ad, what we did, we used the rubric that we had created. And in that rubric, the Justice for Black Farmers ad scored 17. And what I want to like to say about having a rubric or having any tool that will measure things, no tool is perfect. Like sometimes you have to redesign your tool. So you will rarely see a bill that is so comprehensive, that is so robust, that is so big, that in any food and farming related rubric, it was score 17, because or it was scored really high. Because some bills are really specific, and that's what we usually call marker bills, or like really specific programs that do one or two things related to the food system. Obviously, the Justice for Black Farmers Act is a different kind of bill because it has 5 different sections. It has many different sub bills and sub regulations and sub programs inside the bill. So that's one of the reasons this bill was so comprehensive, because it was really comprehensive of the whole food system and especially farming. So here you can see some of the things that this bill scored positive, and were things that were really important to us when designing this rubric, and also identifying what are the kind of bills, what are the kind of actions that we will be taking to advance racial equity in food and agriculture. So one example that was as the simple. This is the most simple question you can ever ask when thinking of racial equity analysis. Was a BIPOC-led organization consulting in the development? We know there's white savior complex. We know there's people who are going to propose legislation, and they will never talk to the people who such legislation is going to impact. So obviously, with Justice for Black Farmers Act, they score positively because many groups and BIPOC-led groups and many stakeholders were engaged in the drafting and consulting in the development of the bill. As you can see, other more specific provisions in the rubric, including like, does this program or bill um, distributes wealth and remain and recommends become economically sustainable through food systems? Other questions were like, does this program or bill actually promote more stable and safe jobs and living wages in the food system? So these are just an example of some of the criteria your members ask us to keep in mind when we're endorsing bills. And obviously, the Justice for Black Farmers Act is a really specific case when, it's a great bill. We were really happy to endorse and we're really happy to take more actions as it's reintroduced, because it will have, again, what David was saying, that transformative impact in the food system that will support young farmers of color for the future. But not every bill is designed like that. And obviously, some bills don't work with the tools you created, and that's happening to me right now. Um, as you know, there's gonna be several immigration related actions happening in the following days by the new President Biden. And basically, we have this tool, a racial equity rubric, and it just like it's not working out. Like basically, it's like in a moment when two bills score so similar, like example, for this example, I put two bills side by side. I will not tell you their names, but they score almost identically, 12 versus 11. And when that happened, that told me that the rubric was not working, at least for something as specific as an immigration bill, because these bills are completely different. They're still different in who is behind it, who they believe on, what the programs will do, and yet they score really similarly. So obviously there's gonna be some really gray area that you can use to create like a racial equity rubric and principles that will guide how you endorse and how you go about policy. And these examples here are like the most basic questions that we ask before we endorse a policy. But when you get to what we call like the nitty gritty, that's when you really have to go further in your analysis for racial equity and think about what is the one really prioritizing racial equity. And that's what I'm gonna be doing the following days. I'm gonna be looking back at the literature on immigration justice or racial equity and actually identifying what is that again, those what are those metrics? What are those what we usually call like key performing indicators that are telling us we're advancing racial equity, and also what our members and what our allies telling us is the one that's really advancing racial equity. So we can definitely endorse the best bill that will advance racial equity in the food system. And this, in this case, is related to immigration. David, I want to get it back to you to talk about a word that I used before you explain it, socially disadvantaged farmer.
Great. Thanks, Vanessa. And yeah, Vanessa was talking about, the way that we can evaluate, whether bills are potentially going to advance racial equity. And the first thing that she called out on one of those slides was whether or not BIPOC communities had been engaged. And that step of including diverse voices, including specifically BIPOC farmers and ranchers in the designing process is really important, and is an important marker, no matter kind of what the legislative language ends up looking like. You're more likely to, succeed in your goal of advancing racial equity and coming up with something that's really progressive if you're involving the right people in the process. But what I'm going to talk about is something more specific to the language, that sometimes to advance racial equity, you not only need sort of a good framework, a good design, you need some race-specific language. You need to talk about race specifically. You need to have mechanisms in order to sort of directly get the results that you're looking for. So as Vanessa mentioned, with the socially disadvantaged definition, I'll get into kind of what that is and some questions that raises for us. And where I'll start in talking about race-specific policy is to call back to a letter that I love to reference. It's such a great resource that was sent to the Elizabeth Warren campaign. Over 70 Black farmers, advocates, researchers, and organizations wrote to Senator Elizabeth Warren's presidential campaign in August of 2019. And one of the main four asks that they included in their letter was that, quote, programs to address racial disparities must be race specific. So I'd like to share a short quote here from that letter that gets into what that means. It says, while Black farmers often face many of the same challenges as other marginalized farmers, there are critical differences between different historically underserved communities. Treating all marginalized farmers as a homogenous group ignores critical differences between us, end quote. So this truth is also reflected in the language in our federal policy platform, which Vanessa was discussing as well. And for an analogy, if we don't acknowledge climate change, for instance, in policy language intended to address a changing climate, then we might be partially successful, but we miss an opportunity there to clearly state the breadth and the depth of that challenge. And in the same way, if we intend to advance racial equity in agriculture through policy change, but we don't discuss the specific oppressions of racial groups, then we miss an opportunity to direct solutions and resources where they're needed most. And we miss an opportunity to incorporate accountability and transparency mechanisms into that language that will guide implementation of those solutions and resources. So one example of policy language designed to address racial disparities in program participation is the socially disadvantaged definition. So the Farm Bill, like any other major legislation that's been established for some time, is an evolving patchwork of underlying language that is either carried forward, amended, or struck every 5 years or so when a new Farm Bill is passed. So reading a more recent Farm Bill, like the 2018 Farm Bill, for instance, is like following a map of references to other underlying statutes. You'll often see something, as referenced in this law in this spot, and then where's that? Well, you got to go and dig and find it. So with the socially disadvantaged definition, it was originally included in the 1990 Farm Bill. The definition there was added by amending the underlying Agriculture Act of 1961 and Consolidated Farm and Rural Development Act. The definition focused on improving USDA programs participation for farmers of color, and specifically discussed racial and ethnic prejudice. And you can see in the slide there a screenshot of the text as enacted, meaning at the time that the bill was passed and enacted, as opposed to how it's been amended over time. And then in 1992, the Agricultural Credit Improvement Act amended the socially disadvantaged definition in the 1961 bill to include gender prejudice in addition to racial and ethnic prejudice. And subsequent farm bills have included references to how this definition was defined in the 1990 bill, as well as the 1961 bill. Um, so this has set up a confusing sort of bifurcation of USDA programs where, for instance, the title of the Farm Bill focused on credit programs, Title V, uses the definition that includes gender, while the title that focuses on conservation, Title II, references the original definition. The 2018 Farm Bill introduced another layer by adding a definition for historically underserved farmers and ranchers, which includes socially disadvantaged, beginning, limited resource, and veteran farmers and ranchers, but does not resolve the difference in the two definitions for socially disadvantaged. So by including gender and by sort of packaging the socially disadvantaged definition with a broader definition, on the one hand, we're lifting up and recognizing the marginalization of all of these different groups, which is great, but we're also sort of layering the original intention of addressing racial and ethnic prejudice and weakening the potential for transparency and accountability. Another quote from the letter that I referenced earlier is that while we, wait, no, I'm sorry, I messed up there. That's a different thing in my notes. This is a quote from our federal policy setting process that I wanted to reference, excuse me. So this is from the federal policy setting platform that Vanessa referenced earlier, quote, while we recognize that individuals in the food and agriculture system don't have the same protections and rights based on structural inequities beyond racism, ableism, sexism, xenophobia, colorism, classism, ageism, homophobia, etc., we affirm that starting with and prioritizing racial equity helps us dismantle other systems of oppression in our society. I'm going to just quickly talk about a couple of examples in state law where racial inequities are specifically being called out. This is certainly not the only examples out there. I think there's been some interesting recent bills that I just haven't dug into yet, but the California Farmer Equity Act is a 2017 proposal that was led by the California Farmer Justice Collaborative, which spoke to the historical and ongoing inequities facing farmers of color in California and established a definition in California state law similar to the federal definition for socially disadvantaged. And the enactment of that measure really kind of paved the way for other future legislative proposals, two of which we were supportive of in 2019 that build on that definition, directing resources specifically to those who have been most marginalized. So that's a really important example of progress there, where state law has kind of evolved to include that level of recognizing some of the problems there and offering some language that people who are drafting future proposals can use to say, we want resources to go here. We want socially disadvantaged farmers to be eligible for very specific things. We want to track how they're participating in programs. It still perpetuates some of the issues that I discussed earlier with that definition, but is considerable progress in discussing race in specific ways in state law. So I will pass it off to Vanessa to talk a little bit more about accountability and transparency.
Thank you, David. That was a really thorough overview. Gave me a lot of flashbacks to really farm bills. So yeah. So we're almost concluding. And before we take your questions, so we can have a conversation about what you're thinking about. But the most important thing I would like to, this quote was given to me my freshman year when I started studying policy in environmental issues, and it has taken with me, and I cannot tell you how many times a week I probably say this to my boss, who always reminds me of this too. You can change what you haven't measured. It's like many times, especially with racial equity and we're thinking about transformative system change, we want to change the system. And the best tool that you can have to change the system is knowing how is the system now, because you need to know what the baseline of the system is, so you know how you want to change it. And and this is just a tool for you to know how important data is. Obviously, We know, I don't remember right now from the top of my head like how many black farmers we have left in the country. Like I know in my county how many black farmers are, zero. So I can tell you based on having that information, I can advocate for things like all the programs that we advocate on your behalf to USDA and many other services. So one of the number one things that especially that we learned in 2020 when all these emergency COVID programs came to be is that it doesn't matter what kind of program it is, even if it's a last minute design program, it doesn't matter if it's a policy, it doesn't matter if it's just literally giving away free money. Um, we need to always collect data. We need to always collect a demographic, geographical, age, and gender, and all the other identities data. Because if we don't know how the program is currently working, who is being served, who is accessing that program right now, we cannot change it. And this is where, if you're working on any piece of legislation, any policy or program at the local, state, or federal level, we always ask you to please put reporting requirements and transparency, because that's the most important tool that we have to change programs and to make sure that we can hold agencies, government, legislators accountable to serving the people that need to be served in actually promoting racial equity in these programs. Just to give you an example, last year, many of you probably heard about the coronavirus food assistance program. Um, in the first 2 months of that program, most of that money went to white farmers in the Midwest that were growing big commodities. Nothing wrong with that, but that money wasn't going to young farmers like you, farmers of color, and diversified operations that are growing a lot of vegetables and fruits. So because we had that information, we were able to have a campaign and we were able to change the policy. And now, when the program was open again, it allowed for more people, for young farmers like you, to apply and get the benefits from it. And we still haven't seen all the data that came out of the second reporting, but we know it's probably better than we saw the first time. And again, that's just to show you how important having data collection and transparency and accountability is, because again, you can change what you haven't measured. So having data available is always a tool to promote racial equity. Um, saying that, we just wanted to give you some updates, recognizing that today is inauguration and there is a lot of changes ahead. There's a lot of speculation right now that President Biden will likely sign an executive order that will embed racial equity across federal policy making and system racism and the barriers to opportunity for federal programs. Basically, it will be like Equity Act is doing in California, that we're definitely putting forward and centering racial equity in any policy making, or it will require future policy decisions to have something like a policy rubric or policy metrics and equity metrics. So this is really helpful. We don't know if it's going to happen or how it's going to look, but this is all what we're thinking is going to happen. It's also possible that Biden will create an Office of Racial Equity in the White House. So his administration can hold all the other departments and agencies accountable to racial equity. And as I mentioned earlier, we know there's going to be immigration actions happening on the first week too. And again, we say obviously racial equity is also immigrant justice. So we need to keep that in mind as we're thinking about what are some of the policy proposals that you may be hearing about, and obviously how it relates to the world that we're living on right now. Like we're thinking a lot about equitable distribution of vaccines and equitable impacts, and also equitable access to many resources that need to be distributed to the most vulnerable. Um, so we just wanted to give you some of those updates for connection to today's inauguration. So just but also we're gonna be sharing some resources with you, and we're gonna post it on the chat shortly. But also I remind you that we are not just chapters in a group of farmers and me. We're also an advocacy and policy hub. So if you haven't signed up for our updates, so you can take actions for federal action, for federal policy and state policy, please sign up for our alerts so you can stay put and hear about what we're doing to advance racial equity and policy. Okay. So I'm gonna stop sharing right now. Please sign up for the updates. And I'm gonna stop recording.